Welcome, dearly beloved anointed ones. They threw dirt on you, but didn't realize you were a seed. Now they're choking on the forest you became. Let that sit for a moment. Because what you survived wasn't random, it was radical preparation, did you know? Bamboo can spend 5 years growing underground with no visible progress. Then in just a few weeks it shoots up over 90 feet into the sky. That's you, chosen one. Silent seasons, strange warfare, delays that looked like denial, but what they didn't see. You weren't stuck, you were rooting. And now? Oh, now it's different. You're not waiting for proof anymore, you are the proof. The shift has already occurred, the war is already won, and what they tried to block is already being delivered, with express divine postage. No return address. The same mouths that swore you were finished are now whispering, how did they do it? The same ones that mocked your stillness are now spiraling from your sudden rise, and let's be real, if silence was your downfall, you would have been done a long time ago. So buckle in, because in this video, we're not just talking about winning, we're talking about the kind of divine comeback that makes even your enemies question reality. And if this is their karma, you might want to pass them a snack. It's going to be a long watch. Let's get into it. Number one, they were betting on you breaking, but you built a kingdom in the rubble. They were counting on you to break. That was the whole plan. They watched you closely, tested you silently, and waited for the moment when life would finally be too much for you. They wanted the pressure to crush you, the setbacks to unravel you, the betrayal to poison you. But what they never expected was that you'd take all that pain and build something from it. You didn't just survive, you evolved. While they whispered behind your back, you were laying bricks in silence. While they threw dirt, you were laying foundations. You were never just sitting there being passive. You were paying attention, learning, adjusting, healing, and stacking invisible wins they couldn't see. You were studying yourself. You were becoming unrecognizable. Not to impress them, but because the storm demanded your transformation. They thought the chaos would leave you defeated, but it trained you. Your heartbreak became your handbook. Your loneliness became your laboratory. You figured out how to lead yourself through the dark with no help, no blueprint, no guarantee. And that's the thing. They thought if they withheld support, you'd fail. But what you actually did was tap into a power they never knew you had. You grew in the soil of their silence. You rose in the absence of applause. You bloomed in the environment they designed to bury you. They misjudged you because they assumed your strength was loud. But your power was always quiet, deep, and strategic. You didn't fight back with noise. You responded with elevation. That's why it worked. You didn't react on their level. You ascended beyond it. Now they're watching, stunned, because it's obvious you didn't just get lucky. You became someone unstoppable. You turned every setback into strategy. You mastered the art of rebuilding without bitterness. And the craziest part? You never even announced the win. You let your glow speak for itself. That's why this victory is different. It didn't come from fighting dirty or forcing outcomes. It came from building a kingdom in the rubble. And doing it so silently, they thought you were losing. Now they know. Whatever you did, it worked. And you didn't just win, you owned the game. Number two, you didn't win because you fought harder, you won because you refused to become them. You didn't win because you were the loudest, the flashiest, or the most aggressive. You won because you stayed solid when everything around you was trying to make you bitter. They came for your peace, your name, your confidence, and tried every dirty trick to drag you down to their level. But you didn't take the bait, and that's exactly why they lost. See, they wanted you to snap, to stoop, to retaliate in the way they would have. They needed you to respond like them so they could justify their own mess. But instead you stood in your truth and kept your dignity. You chose not to become what hurt you. And that takes a different kind of strength. That's not weakness. That's power under control. They thought they were playing a game of war, but you weren't playing at all. You were healing. You were protecting your energy. You were letting God handle what your hands were too sacred to touch. Because if you had clapped back, they would have called you angry. If you had exposed them, they would have called you petty. If you had fought back, they would have said, see, they're just like us. But you stayed in your lane. You moved with class. You let your growth speak louder than any insult ever could. That's the real win. Not just getting ahead, but doing it without ever compromising who you are. You didn't have to scheme, lie, or destroy someone to get where you are. You chose integrity over attention, grace over gossip, purpose over pride. That's not common, and that's why they couldn't predict your rise. They thought you were passive, but really, you were calculating, observing, discerning. You were watching how people moved when they thought you were weak. You let them reveal themselves. And then you simply stepped out of the way. You let karma walk through the front door while you focused on your next level. And now, you've arrived, and you still have your character intact. That's why it's already yours. Because while they were trying to win the battle, you were becoming the kind of person who could inherit the whole war. You didn't just win, you rose above, and there's no comeback louder than quiet integrity. Number 3, they thought delays meant denial, but you were busy getting crowned in private. They thought the delay meant you lost. They assumed because nothing loud was happening around you that nothing powerful was happening in you. But what they couldn't see was that you were in a sacred season of alignment. You weren't being ignored, you were being prepared. See, people forget that real breakthroughs don't shout. They build, quietly, underground, in the dark where no one's clapping, no one's checking, and no one sees the internal victories. And that's exactly where your real power was formed. Not in the spotlight, but in the silence. While they were rushing toward attention, you were being refined for impact. They looked at your stillness and thought it was stagnation. They didn't know that some victories require still waters, not noise. What looked like you being stuck was really divine strategy. God was withholding movement until everything was in place. Your heart, your mindset, your boundaries, your discernment. Because a blessing given too early can feel like a curse, but you stayed the course even when it made no sense. And you'll notice, the more you got aligned, the less you needed to announce. The more peace you found, the less you cared about proving a point. That's when you really started winning. Because the delay didn't kill your drive, it focused it. You stopped fighting battles that weren't yours. You let go of roles you had outgrown. You weren't chasing anymore, you were becoming. That's why things are unfolding now, suddenly, effortlessly. Because you're not the same person they remember. And the doors opening now aren't opening because you begged or forced them. They're opening because you're finally ready. Everything you thought you missed is catching up to you. And the ones who thought you were out of the game are starting to realize you are the game. You didn't miss your season. It was waiting on you to step into your higher self. That's why it worked. Because you stopped watching the clock and started trusting the process. You didn't rush the fruit. You honored the root. And now that the shift has happened, it's clear. Whatever they thought about you, they were wrong. The delay didn't deny you. It defined you. Number 4, you mastered the art of suffering without self-pity. You mastered the art of suffering without self-pity. You went through hell, but you didn't make a show out of it. You didn't cry for an audience. You didn't turn your pain into a performance. While most people collapse when things fall apart, you stood up with shaking hands and decided to be the one who saves you. That's a level of power they can't understand. You felt every cut. You heard every lie. You lived through betrayals, setbacks, delays, and silent battles no one ever clapped for. And yet, you didn't ask for pity. You didn't wear your pain like a costume just to get sympathy. You allowed the pain to teach you instead of define you. You didn't just feel hurt, you learned from it. You studied your scars like scripture and turned them into strength. People were watching, waiting for the breakdown. They thought the silence meant defeat. They didn't know you were working on the inside. You were confronting wounds that would have crushed most people. You didn't skip steps. You didn't numb it. You sat with it. And that's why you're not bitter. You're not fake healed. You did the real work. While they were mocking you or ignoring you, you were outgrowing the very version of you they thought they destroyed. They tried to break you so you'd come crawling back. They expected you to crumble under the weight of it all. But you didn't fall apart. You rebuilt piece by piece with no help and no spotlight. That's what makes you different. You didn't beg for comfort. You became your own comfort. You became your own guide, your own counselor, your own protector. You went inward, and that's where the breakthrough happened. Not in a rescue, in a revelation. Now, when they look at you, they don't see the pain. They see the glow that was born from it. You don't have to explain yourself. The peace you carry says everything. That's why it worked. Because you didn't make pain your identity. You made it your turning point. And now they're confused. Because you didn't get softer, you got sharper. You didn't become a victim, you became a vessel. You didn't suffer in vain, you suffered with purpose, and you came out transformed. Number 5, you didn't need revenge, Elevation handled the exposure. You didn't waste your time trying to get even. You didn't post cryptic messages. You didn't go on a rant, drop names, or send out evidence just to prove a point. You stayed quiet when it hurt the most. And that silence wasn't weakness. It was discipline. You knew that real revenge doesn't come through noise. It comes through elevation. You didn't have to expose them. Life did that for you. The same people who tried to assassinate your character are now struggling to hold up the fake version of themselves they created. And the best part? You didn't lift a finger to bring them down. You let time do the talking. You let God handle what your mouth didn't have to. You trusted that truth doesn't need a spokesperson, it just needs space. You could have burned it all down. You had every right to, but you chose peace over pettiness. And that decision changed everything, because while they were trying to destroy you with rumors, you were rising in silence. While they were focused on bringing you low, you were being pulled higher. That's the kind of elevation no lie can survive in. The truth is, you were never fighting for their approval. You were working on your purpose. You knew who you were, even when they tried to paint you as something else. And now, your life is starting to reflect what you knew all along. You don't have to explain what happened. Your glow is the explanation. Your peace is the proof. Your growth is the clapback. They wanted you to break character and act out of emotion. They wanted you to look guilty, unstable, or petty, but you didn't fall for it. You protected your spirit, and that protection turned into promotion. You let your transformation speak in a language only the spirit understands. And now the people who misunderstood you are watching the truth reveal itself in slow motion. You didn't need revenge. You needed time, growth, and elevation. And once those three things aligned, everything that was hidden came to light, without you saying a word. That's why you won, because you didn't let pain pull you out of character. You let purpose pull you higher. Number 6, you became the proof that God's strategy looks like insanity to the uninitiated. To most people watching, it looked like you were falling off. You weren't showing up like you used to. You weren't sharing like before. You were distant, private, quiet. And to them, that meant something was wrong. They assumed you were slipping, failing, fading. But what they didn't realize was that you were right in the middle of God's strategy. And that strategy doesn't make sense to those who aren't tuned into the Spirit. You had to move differently. Not because you wanted to look mysterious, but because what you were carrying required protection. Every step had to be led, not forced. Every boundary had to be placed with precision, not explained for approval. You couldn't afford distractions. You couldn't keep entertaining the same cycles and still expect breakthrough. So you fell back, not out of weakness, but out of wisdom. They called it pride because you stopped making yourself easily available. They called it fear because you didn't jump at every opportunity. They called it loss because you chose stillness over spotlight. But they didn't see the instructions you were under. They didn't know the level of obedience it took to not react, not defend, not prove. You were moving in silence because the noise would have delayed your alignment. That's why they're confused now. Because what's unfolding in your life doesn't match their version of success. You didn't chase, you attracted. You didn't hustle for the spotlight, you were placed in it. You didn't market yourself like crazy, but now doors are opening without effort, and none of it adds up on paper. It doesn't look fair, it doesn't look logical. And that's the point, because favor will never make sense to people who only understand formulas. You're the proof that what God builds can't be explained, only revealed. And when it reveals itself, it doesn't need a backstory. It stands on its own. You didn't follow the path they expected. You followed the one God gave you. And even when it looked like you were going nowhere, you kept going. That's why it worked. That's why you won. Because you trusted a plan bigger than their opinions. And now the outcome is blowing their minds. Number 7. Your discernment was the weapon they didn't know you had. They thought they were 10 steps ahead of you. They thought their mind games, gossip, and manipulation would throw you off balance. They believed they could twist narratives, bait you into reactions, or slowly wear you down through subtle sabotage. What they didn't see coming was your discernment, sharp, silent, and surgical. You weren't playing the same game they were. While they were scheming in the physical, you were tuned into the spiritual. You saw things before they happened. You felt shifts before they were visible. You caught intentions mid-smile. You didn't need proof. Your spirit was already reading the room. That's why they kept getting confused. You weren't responding like they expected because you weren't operating from the same dimension. You weren't reacting out of ego. You were moving with awareness. You chose your words carefully. You protected your energy with intention. You walked away from things not because you were scared, but because you already knew what was coming. That's not fear, that's strategy. They kept trying to set you up emotionally, mentally, socially, but you kept dodging traps they were sure you'd fall into. That wasn't luck, that was spiritual insight. You weren't second-guessing yourself anymore. You knew what you carried, you knew who you were, you knew what peace felt like, and anything that disrupted it got removed without warning or apology. You let people show you who they were. You didn't argue, you didn't expose. You simply observed, adjusted, and elevated. That's what threw them off. They expected noise. You gave them clarity. They expected drama. You gave them distance. They expected weakness. You gave them wisdom. And while they were exhausting themselves trying to provoke you, you were being elevated in silence. You didn't have to clap back, react emotionally, or defend your every move. You let your discernment guide you like a compass through all their confusion. That's why you kept winning even when it looked like you were quiet. You were never behind. You were never unaware. You were just precise. You read the battle before it started. And by the time they realized they couldn't outsmart you, you were already gone, unbothered, unreachable, victorious. Number 8, you didn't just survive the fire, you became fireproof. You went through what should have destroyed you. The pressure, the heartbreak, the betrayals, the mental and emotional warfare, all of it was meant to break you down completely. And for a while it almost did. But instead of turning to ash, you turned to armor. You didn't just survive the fire, you let it forge you. Those battles didn't just challenge your emotions. They rewired your nervous system. They rewrote how you see people, how you move, how you think, how you protect your peace. You're not reacting the same. You don't panic like you used to. You don't need external reassurance like before. That version of you that was easily triggered, easily swayed, easily broken, gone. Now, the same type of storm that used to leave you on the floor doesn't even shake you. You've been through too much to flinch over what doesn't carry real weight. You've been tested at your core, and through every test, every loss, every lonely night, you didn't just hold on, you transformed. That's why the attacks don't work anymore. They trained you into becoming untouchable. People who knew the old version of you keep trying to press the same buttons, but the buttons don't work anymore. They're still dealing with who you used to be, unaware that you've been upgraded through fire. You had to face your own shadows. You had to feel pain most people run from, but you didn't run. You endured it, processed it, and grew from it. And now you're not just stronger, you're unshakable, not because you're cold or numb, but because you understand. You've seen the worst. You've felt the depths. You know what darkness looks like, so you don't fear it anymore. You walk through it differently, with clarity, with discernment, with power. That's what people don't get. They see your calm and call it pride. They see your silence and call it arrogance. But really, you're just not moved by the things that used to tear you apart, not because you're above it, but because you grew through it. The fire tried to consume you, but it ended up crowning you. You're fireproof now. And no weapon formed against you even makes a dent. Number 9, you let the humiliation humble you, then used the humility to build an empire. They thought the humiliation would crush you. They thought the way they disrespected you, excluded you, mocked you, and misunderstood you would make you fold. And to be honest, it did hurt, it shook you, it left marks. But it didn't make you bitter, it made you wise. You didn't let the shame destroy your self-worth, you let it humble you. You let it strip away the ego, the people-pleasing, the false sense of control. You let it teach you who you really are when you have nothing to prove and no one clapping for you. That level of self-awareness became your foundation. It became the quiet ground you stood on when nothing made sense. While most people let humiliation harden them, you let it soften you in the right places. Not into weakness, but into depth. You stopped needing to be liked. You stopped performing. You stopped chasing things that drained your soul. You sat with the pain and let it teach you. You rewired your soul in private. You decided you weren't going to come out of this looking impressive. You were going to come out whole. You weren't building from pride. You were building from purpose. You didn't want revenge. You wanted restoration. You weren't focused on proving anyone wrong. You were focused on becoming the most healed, grounded, aligned version of yourself possible. And that's exactly what made the victory hit different. This win isn't loud. It's not about getting back at them. It's about how you rose without pretending. It's about how you created peace out of chaos. How you used every tear, every disappointment, every rejection as a brick, and laid the foundation of your empire without anyone even noticing. You were too busy becoming to be distracted by petty battles. The truth is, if you had fought back out of pride, you would have won a moment. But because you let it humble you, you won a lifetime. That's why the blessing is permanent. Because it's not built on ego, it's built on evolution. And now that it's all unfolding, people are stunned because they thought they buried you in humiliation. They didn't realize they were handing you the very soil you would use to build something untouchable. Number 10, you didn't force doors. You became the key. You didn't beg for access. You didn't manipulate your way into rooms. You weren't out here performing just to be noticed. While others were trying to talk their way into favor, you were doing the inner work. You were getting aligned. You were healing, evolving, and elevating quietly. And that alignment is what turned you into the key, not just to open doors, but to become the door. While people were exhausting themselves chasing platforms, you were becoming solid enough to sustain one. You were not focused on being seen. You were focused on being real. And because of that, you didn't have to force anything. You reached a level of clarity and purpose that made certain things start finding you. Rooms started whispering your name. People started wondering how you got there without being loud. They didn't see the internal rewiring that made you magnetic. Your presence now carries weight. You don't have to push to prove. You don't have to chase to convince. You walk into spaces and shift the energy, not because you demanded the room, but because your growth prepared you for it. You're not hustling to fit in. You're attracting places that match who you've become. This didn't happen by luck. It didn't happen by strategy. It happened by surrender. You stopped chasing what wasn't aligned. You stopped applying pressure in places where your presence wasn't valued. And in that stillness, your energy recalibrated. You went from trying to get in to becoming the reason the room even matters. Now the people who overlooked you are circling back. The opportunities that once ignored you are reappearing. But you're different now. You're not desperate, you're discerning, because you know who you are, and that self-knowing makes you unstoppable. That's why this season is so unique. You didn't force it. You became it. You became the version of you who is qualified, rooted, and ready. So the doors that are opening now aren't just open, they're drawn to you. Not because you begged, not because you campaigned, but because your growth became a frequency that opportunity could no longer ignore. You are not waiting to be chosen, you are being recognized. Number 11, you didn't need an audience, you needed authority. You stopped needing the crowd. You stopped measuring your worth by who was clapping or watching. You realized the most dangerous thing you could ever do was build your identity on applause. Because applause fades, people flip, and public opinion is always up for auction. So you stepped back, not because you were losing, but because you were being lifted. You understood something most people miss. Validation is fragile. It can be bought, faked, or snatched the moment you stop entertaining others. But authority, real spiritual authority, that comes from alignment, from obedience, from enduring storms and not losing your soul in the process. That kind of power can't be given by people, and it definitely can't be taken by them either. That's why you move differently. You stopped explaining your silence. You stopped defending your process. You weren't trying to go viral. You were going vertical. You weren't chasing relevance. You were chasing revelation. You didn't care if the world understood your isolation because you knew who was calling you inward. You were being licensed in the spirit before you were ever noticed in the physical. There were seasons where it looked like you had disappeared. People assumed you gave up. They thought you had nothing going on. What they didn't see was the elevation happening behind the scenes, the kind of growth that's not loud but undeniable. You weren't being overlooked. You were being anointed. You came to understand that it's better to have favor with God than fame with people. Because when the spotlight finds you and your spirit is already rooted, you don't fold under the pressure. You carry it. That's what spiritual rank does. It stabilizes you in spaces that ego can't survive. You're not desperate to be liked anymore. You're not trying to fit into circles that weren't built for your calling. You've outgrown the need for attention because your confidence is now tied to who sent you, not who sees you. And that's why you're winning, because while others were auditioning for approval, you were being appointed in silence. And when it's God who licenses you, there's no audience that can revoke it. Number 12. You didn't just endure the process, you mastered it. You didn't just survive the process, you studied it. You paid attention to the patterns, the lessons, the quiet instructions hidden inside every delay, every disappointment, and every detour. You weren't just going through it, you were growing through it. That's what made all the difference. Most people check out during the waiting season. They get angry, distracted, bitter. They start comparing themselves. They blame life, blame people, blame timing. But you stayed in it with eyes wide open. You let the pain teach you. You let the delays develop you. You didn't just count the time, you used it, and that's rare. You realized early on that the process was never about punishment. It was preparation, it was sharpening. It was about shedding false identities and breaking toxic cycles. It was about refining your character so that what's meant for you doesn't destroy you when it finally arrives. You weren't just waiting on breakthrough. You were becoming the kind of person who could carry it well. You weren't whining, you were working, not loudly but deeply. You were healing generational wounds. You were learning how to love yourself better. You were breaking trauma patterns, elevating your mindset, upgrading your spiritual discernment. That's not surviving, that's mastery. The same fire that would have broken the old you is the reason this new version of you can't be shaken. You learned to take hard moments and turn them into wisdom. You stopped asking, why me? And started asking, what is this teaching me? That shift changed everything, and now people are starting to notice. They can't figure out how you're so calm, so grounded, so clear. And it's because you did the work. You didn't take shortcuts. You didn't fake the healing. You didn't distract yourself with noise. You sat in the furnace and let it refine you. That's why what's coming is going to stay, because you didn't rush the process. You mastered it. You let it mold you. You respected it, even when it hurt. And now you're not just prepared, you're equipped. Not just to receive the blessing, but to sustain it, lead with it, and protect it from anything that tries to tear it down. Number 13. You refuse to let your trauma become your personality. You refuse to let your trauma become your personality. You made a bold decision that most never do. To face the hard stuff instead of hiding behind it. You could have let the pain define you. You could have used it as a shield, a reason, an excuse, but you didn't. You outgrew the urge to stay wounded for attention. You chose healing over performance. They expected you to stay stuck in the story, to keep replaying what happened, to make pain your brand and suffering your language, because that's what most people do. They live through pain once and then replay it for the rest of their lives. But you knew there had to be more. So you went inward. You dug into the mess. You confronted the shadow parts of yourself that others avoid. And instead of blaming the world, you did the hardest thing. You started with you. You didn't sugarcoat anything. You got real with your patterns, your triggers, your survival responses. You asked yourself uncomfortable questions and gave yourself honest answers. You didn't just want to feel better. You wanted to be better. And because of that, the healing went deep. You weren't just patching surface wounds, you were changing your internal wiring. That's why your glow hits differently now, because it's not based on aesthetics or approval. It's built on wholeness. You're not pretending to be fine, you are fine, and it shows. Your energy is clear, your boundaries are solid, your presence feels safe. People can sense the difference between someone who healed and someone who's still bleeding behind the mask. You could have built your life around your pain and collected sympathy like currency, but you wanted freedom, not attention. You didn't want your trauma to be the most interesting thing about you, so you turned inward and started writing a new narrative, one rooted in power, clarity, and truth. Now, when people see you, they don't see a victim. They see victory. Not because life was easy, but because you refused to let the worst parts of your story define the rest of your life. Your glow is not decoration. It's a signal that you did the real, ugly, courageous work, and it came from within. Number 14, your surrender was your strategy, not your weakness. You didn't force your way to the top. You didn't obsess over the outcome or try to micromanage every detail. You weren't glued to timelines or driven by fear. You surrendered fully. And that's exactly why it worked. What looked like passivity to others was actually deep trust. You weren't giving up. You were getting in alignment. People assumed you were weak for letting go. They thought you lacked direction because you weren't rushing or panicking. But the truth is, you had reached a level of spiritual maturity that most don't even understand, where peace becomes the strategy and surrender becomes the weapon. You didn't need to control it because you trusted that what was for you would never pass you by. You stopped begging doors to open. You stopped trying to convince people to see your value. You stopped attaching your worth to outcomes. Instead, you got still, you got clear, you handed the pieces over to God and said, do what only you can do. And he did, but not in the way anyone expected. Because surrender isn't sitting back and doing nothing. It's making bold moves without panic. It's moving in faith without needing full proof. It's saying no to things that glitter but aren't gold. It's choosing alignment over urgency. That's not weakness, that's spiritual intelligence. And now the very people who questioned your silence, your distance, your slowness, they're stunned. Because somehow everything you were trusting for has started showing up, not forced, not fake, real. It's coming together in ways they can't trace. And they don't understand how you knew, how you stayed calm when things looked like they were falling apart, how you knew to wait, how you knew it would align. You didn't have insider information, you had insight, you had trust, and that trust became the bridge to things no strategy could have pulled off. While others were exhausting themselves trying to manipulate outcomes, you were flowing in divine order. That's why it's all clicking now. Your surrender wasn't you giving up. It was you giving in to something greater. And that's what changed everything. Because the moment you released control, everything started to respond to your faith, not your force. And now the results are undeniable. You didn't just survive, you transcended. You didn't just win, you embodied the win, not through force, manipulation, or noise, but through inner mastery, divine timing, and raw obedience to the unseen. Everything they thought would break you, built you. Every season that looked like silence was a setup. Every loss was a disguised initiation into something far greater than you could explain at the time. You walked through fire without becoming bitter. You endured storms without becoming cold. You rewrote the code of your soul while the world wasn't watching. And now that it's all unfolding, they're shocked. But you're not, because you knew. You knew that surrender was strategy. You knew that pain could be alchemized into wisdom. You knew that favor doesn't follow the loudest. It follows the most aligned. Now your life speaks volumes without a single explanation. The glow, the peace, the strength, they weren't purchased. They were earned in the dark. You didn't just make it, you mastered it. You didn't just hope for change, then you became the change. And that's why it's yours now, not by luck, not by chance, but by spiritual rank and relentless growth. So if they're still wondering how you did it, let them wonder. You don't owe them a blueprint. Your elevation is the blueprint. You don't need to explain what grace has already proven. You didn't play the game. You rose above it. Whatever you did, it worked. You won. And not just a moment, a movement within yourself. And now, you are completely unstoppable. If this message spoke to your spirit, don't keep it to yourself. Share the light. Like the video if you felt seen, understood, or empowered. Comment below and let us know which part hit you the hardest. Your story could be the confirmation someone else needs. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss a moment of truth, growth, and divine revelation, and share this with someone who needs to be reminded that their process has a purpose and their pain was not in vain. This isn't just content, it's a community. Welcome home, let's rise together. God bless you. God.